Elena Vasquez sat in the back corner of the xenobiology lecture hall, her worn tablet balanced on her knees as she sketched the complex molecular structures Professor Zektar was displaying. Around her, students from 12 different species filled the curved amphitheater of the Galactic Academic Consortium's flagship campus on Kepler Station. The low hum of universal translators created a constant background noise, punctuated by the occasional clicking of Arthanian mandibles or the harmonic whistles of melodic communication. She had chosen this seat on her first day 3 years ago and had occupied it ever since. Not because she was antisocial, but because Elena had learned long ago that observation from the periphery often revealed more than participation at the center. Her human classmates thought she was shy. The alien students barely noticed her at all. Professor Zektar, a towering Cathani with crystalline skin that reflected the holographic displays in rainbow patterns, gestured toward a complex protein chain with one of his 4 arms. The unique aspect of Terran biochemistry, his voice resonated through the translator with an odd metallic undertone, is its apparent chaos. Where most evolved species demonstrate logical, efficient biological processes, human biology seems to embrace redundancy. Elena's stylus paused mid-stroke. She had heard this observation countless times during her xenobiology studies. Humans were inefficient. Humans were redundant. Humans were evolutionary accidents that somehow stumbled into intelligence despite their biological shortcomings. Take the human immune system, Professor Zektar continued, his secondary arms manipulating the hologram to show cellular interactions. Instead of the elegant singular defense mechanisms found in advanced species, humans maintain multiple overlapping systems. Adaptive immunity, innate immunity, inflammatory responses, cellular regeneration protocols that activate under stress. It's almost as if evolution couldn't decide on a proper design. A few students chittered in amusement. Elena had heard that sound before, the galactic equivalent of polite laughter at humanity's expense. She continued sketching, her expression unchanged. Jira S., a Lyrian student with silver-blue skin and elongated limbs, raised one graceful hand. Professor, isn't this redundancy why humans require such extensive medical intervention? My species has not experienced illness in over 2 millennia. Precisely. Professor Zektar's crystal facets caught the light as he nodded. The Lyrian evolutionary path exemplified efficiency. Single-purpose organs, streamlined biological processes, perfect harmony between mind and body. Humans, by contrast, seem to have retained every survival mechanism their species ever developed, creating biological systems that constantly conflict with each other. Elena looked up from her tablet to scan her classmates. The Lyrians sat with perfect posture, their breathing synchronized and barely perceptible. The Cathani students radiated calm confidence, their crystalline skin phases indicating peaceful meditation. Even the usually energetic Arthanian students sat in ordered rows, their compound eyes fixed attentively on the professor. She was the only human in this particular class. There were others on campus, maybe 30 scattered across the station's various programs, but they tended to cluster together in the human-dominated fields like military strategy, engineering innovation, and what the galaxy diplomatically termed creative problem-solving. Elena had chosen xenobiology because she was genuinely fascinated by the elegant biological solutions other species had evolved. The melodic's ability to communicate through harmonic frequencies that could convey complex emotional and intellectual concepts simultaneously. The Zephyrian talent for metabolizing almost any organic compound. The crystalline collective's method of sharing memories directly through bioelectric interfaces. Her tablet chimed softly with an incoming message. Elena glanced down, expecting another academic notification, but instead saw her mother's face in a small video window. Emergency family communication authorized. the tablet's AI announced in a whisper-quiet voice that wouldn't disturb the lecture. Priority level. Maximum. Elena's stomach dropped. Her mother, Dr. Sarah Vasquez, was a civilian contractor working with the Human Colonial Defense Initiative. She wouldn't interrupt Elena's classes unless something significant had happened. She activated the privacy screen and opened the message. Her mother's face filled the small display, but something was wrong. Dr. Vasquez's usually composed expression was tight with worry, and her laboratory coat was wrinkled as if she'd been working for days without rest. "Elena, sweetheart, I need you to listen very carefully." Her mother's voice came through the audio pickup, barely above a whisper. "The Consortium Council is about to make an announcement, but I wanted you to hear this from me first. The Tri-Species Alliance has formally declared war against human space." Elena's stylus clattered to the floor. Around her, the lecture continued with Professor Zektar explaining the inefficiencies of human neural architecture, but the words seemed to come from very far away. "The official announcement will come in approximately 6 hours," her mother continued. "They're calling it a preventive action to contain humanity's aggressive expansion into contested territories." "Elena, you need to understand. This isn't about territory. The intelligence reports suggest the Alliance has been planning this for years. They've been waiting for the right moment to act." Elena glanced around the lecture hall with new eyes. The Lyrians, Kethani, and Arthanians had been humanity's closest allies in the Galactic Consortium for decades. Trade partnerships, cultural exchange programs, joint research initiatives, all of it had seemed to represent a harmonious future where different species worked together toward common goals. But now she noticed details she had overlooked before. The way alien students often fell silent when human students approached their conversation groups. The subtle changes in seating arrangements that had gradually segregated the species over the past semester. The increasingly frequent academic discussions about human irregularities and inefficiencies. Her mother's message continued. "I'm transmitting everything I can to your secure partition. Research data, communication intercepts, analysis reports. Elena, what I'm about to tell you might sound paranoid, but I need you to be careful about who you trust. The war declaration isn't coming from the Alliance military leadership. It's coming from their academic and scientific communities." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's climate control. "They've convinced their governments that humans represent an evolutionary threat to galactic stability, not because we're physically dangerous, but because our biological and psychological inefficiencies might contaminate other species through prolonged contact. They're particularly concerned about human irrationality and our tendency toward what they call chaotic problem-solving methods." Professor Zektar's voice seemed to echo strangely as he moved on to discussing human emotional regulation systems. Humans experience an unusually broad spectrum of emotional states, often simultaneously. This creates psychological instability that manifests in unpredictable decision-making patterns. Elena realized she was holding her breath. "I'm going to be completely honest with you," her mother's recording continued. "The first phase of their military action targets human civilian populations in the outer colonies. They believe that by demonstrating human vulnerability, they can force Earth to accept a negotiated surrender that would place humanity under consortium oversight. Elena, they're planning to show the galaxy that humans can be broken." The message paused, and Elena could see her mother struggling with what to say next. "I don't know how long communications between human and consortium space will remain open. If you need to leave Kepler Station, your student visa should protect you for approximately 72 hours after the war declaration. But after that," her mother's voice trailed off. "Elena, I know you've always been fascinated by other species and their capabilities. You've spent your entire academic career studying how much more efficient and elegant they are compared to humanity. But I need you to remember something your grandmother told me during the Proxima crisis, something her grandmother told her during the water wars on Earth. Elena leaned closer to the screen. She said that humans aren't built for efficiency. We're built for survival. All those redundant biological systems the professors love to criticize, all those emotional complexities and irrational responses, they're not bugs in human design. They're features. And sometimes, when everything goes wrong, those features are the only things that keep us alive. The message timer showed 30 seconds remaining. I love you, sweetheart. Whatever happens, remember that you're exactly where you need to be. The galaxy is about to learn something about humanity that they never understood from their academic studies. Be safe, be smart, and never forget that sometimes the quietest voices carry the most important messages. The message ended, leaving Elena staring at a blank screen, while Professor Zektar continued his lecture about the evolutionary dead ends of human physiology. She looked around the hall again, but this time she wasn't seeing her classmates. She was seeing the representatives of species that had just declared war on her people. Species that had studied humanity for years, cataloged every weakness, documented every inefficiency, and concluded that humans were a threat that needed to be contained. Elena closed her tablet and began gathering her belongings with deliberate calm. As she stood to leave, Professor Zektar paused in his lecture. Miss Vasquez, are you feeling unwell? Every head in the amphitheater turned toward her. Elena met the professor's crystalline gaze and felt an odd clarity settle over her thoughts. No, Professor. I feel perfectly human. She walked up the steps toward the exit, acutely aware of the silence that followed her. At the door, she turned back to face the lecture hall. Professor, you mentioned that human biology seems chaotic because evolution couldn't decide on a proper design. Has it ever occurred to you that maybe evolution knew exactly what it was doing? She left before he could respond, but she heard the uncomfortable stirring of the class behind her. Elena had spent 3 years being the quiet student nobody noticed, absorbing everything, learning from everyone, and gradually understanding how the galaxy viewed her species. Now she understood something else. The war had already begun, and the first battlefield wasn't in space. It was in the hearts and minds of everyone who believed they knew what humanity was capable of. Elena walked through the corridors of Kepler Station toward her dormitory, but she wasn't planning to pack. Instead, she was planning to bear witness. If the galaxy wanted to learn about human capabilities, she was going to make sure they got a complete education. Her tablet contained not just her mother's files, but also 3 years of careful observations about every species represented on Kepler Station. She knew their strengths, their weaknesses, their cultural blind spots, and their assumptions about human behavior. What they didn't know was that Elena had inherited more than just her mother's scientific mind. Her grandmother had been a war correspondent during the Proxima crisis. Her great-grandmother had documented the water wars. The Vasquez women had a tradition of recording history as it happened, of making sure that the truth survived even when everything else fell apart. Elena reached her dormitory room and activated her personal recording equipment. If the galaxy wanted to understand humanity, she was going to show them exactly what they had just declared war against. She looked directly into the camera and began to speak. Day 1 of the Tri-Species Alliance War Against Humanity. My name is Elena Vasquez, and I'm the only human student currently enrolled in xenobiology studies at the Galactic Academic Consortium. For 3 years, I've listened to lectures about human biological inefficiency, emotional instability, and evolutionary failures. Today, I learned that those lectures weren't academic discussions. They were military intelligence briefings. Elena paused, thinking about her mother's words, her grandmother's stories. and the centuries of human survival that had led to this moment. The Alliance has made a fundamental error in their analysis of human capabilities. They've studied our biology, our psychology, and our cultural patterns, but they've missed the most important aspect of human nature. We don't survive because we're efficient. We survive because we're stubborn. She smiled for the first time since receiving her mother's message. This is Elena Vasquez, xenobiology student and daughter of survivors, beginning what will be a complete documentation of exactly why the galaxy underestimated humanity. If these recordings survive, I want future generations to understand what happened here and why it happened the way it did. Elena settled back in her chair and began uploading her mother's files while organizing her own observations from 3 years of careful study. The war had begun, but she had a feeling that the species who declared it had no idea what they had just awakened. Outside her window, the stars looked the same as always, but Elena knew that everything had changed. The galaxy was about to get a comprehensive education in human capabilities, and she was going to be their teacher. She just hoped she would live long enough to see how well they learned. Elena had been recording for 17 days when the first human colony fell. The news reached Kepler Station through official consortium channels, delivered in the same neutral tones used for routine administrative announcements. The Alliance humanitarian action in the Tau Ceti system has concluded successfully. Colonial population centers have been secured with minimal resistance. Human colonial administrators have been placed in protective custody pending negotiations. Elena looked up from her tablet where she had been analyzing atmospheric composition data from human agricultural worlds. Around her in the station's central commons area, alien students continued their discussions about upcoming exams and research projects. The destruction of New Eden, home to 4 million humans, warranted the same emotional response as a weather report. She activated her recording equipment with a gesture so practiced it had become unconscious. Day 17. The Alliance just announced the fall of Tau Ceti. They're calling it minimal resistance, which in military terminology usually means the defenders fought until there was nothing left to fight with. Elena kept her voice level, professional, but her hands trembled slightly as she accessed the files her mother had transmitted. According to intercepted communications, the human colonial defense lasted 6 days against a superior force. The Alliance fleet expected surrender within hours based on their projections of human psychological breaking points. They calculated that faced with overwhelming odds, humans would choose survival over resistance. Elena paused her recording and pulled up tactical analyses from the colony's final transmissions. The data told a story that no academic study had ever captured. What the Alliance didn't anticipate was how humans respond when their backs are against the wall. The colonial defenders didn't just fight, they improvised. When their weapon systems were disabled, they used agricultural equipment. When their shields failed, they deployed mining charges. When their communications were jammed, they used children's toys modified to carry messages between defensive positions. Elena had spent years studying the elegant efficiency of other species' military doctrines. The Lyrians fought with mathematical precision, calculating optimal strategies and executing them flawlessly. The Kethani used their crystalline physiology to create nearly perfect coordination between units. The Arthanians employed their hive-like communication systems to achieve tactical responses that seemed almost telepathic. But the human colonists had done something that made no sense according to established military theory. They had gotten more dangerous as their situation became more hopeless. The final transmission from Colony Defense Coordinator Martinez is particularly illuminating, Elena continued, accessing the audio file. Quote, "We know we can't win. We've known that since day one. But every hour we hold out is another hour for other colonies to prepare, another hour for Earth to mobilize, another hour for the galaxy to see what we're willing to do to protect our own." End quote. Elena saved the recording and began walking through the station's corridors, observing her alien classmates with new eyes. Over the past 17 days, she had noticed subtle changes in their behavior. Conversations became quieter when she approached. Study groups that had previously included human students were now exclusively single species. Most telling of all, her professors had begun discussing human biology and psychology with what sounded like clinical concern rather than academic curiosity. She had also noticed something else. Her own behavior was changing. 3 weeks ago, Elena would have retreated to her dormitory room and absorbed herself in studies, avoiding the social tension that now permeated the station. But something about documenting the war, about bearing witness to events as they unfolded, had awakened something in her that felt distinctly human. She was becoming stubborn. Elena made her way to Professor Zektar's office. She had scheduled an appointment to discuss her thesis research, but she had other plans for the conversation. Professor Zektar's office reflected his species' aesthetic preferences: crystalline furniture that caught and refracted light, walls that displayed slowly shifting geometric patterns, and an atmosphere maintained at the slightly higher pressure that Kethani physiology preferred. Elena had visited this office dozens of times over the years, but today the space felt different, less welcoming, more clinical. "Miss Vasquez." Professor Zektar's voice carried a slight harmonic undertone that Elena had learned to recognize as mild stress. "Please, sit. I understand you wanted to discuss your research on comparative immune system evolution." Elena activated her tablet's recording function and placed it on the professor's desk, making no effort to hide what she was doing. "Actually, Professor, I wanted to discuss your recent lectures about human biological redundancy, specifically your theory that human survival systems represent evolutionary inefficiency." Professor Zektar's crystalline skin shifted to a deeper blue, a color Elena had learned indicated discomfort. "Miss Vasquez, given current political tensions, perhaps we should focus on your academic work rather than theoretical discussions about species characteristics." "I think current events make this discussion particularly relevant," Elena replied. "You've spent considerable time explaining why human biology is chaotic and inefficient. But I'm wondering if you've considered the possibility that what looks like chaos might actually be adaptive strategy." "I'm not sure I follow your meaning." Elena pulled up a holographic display showing comparative biological data. "Take human stress response systems. You've criticized them as redundant and conflicting. We have fight-or-flight responses, but also tend and befriend behaviors. We have emotional systems that can make us either more or less rational depending on circumstances. Our immune systems launch multiple overlapping responses that sometimes work at cross purposes." Professor Zektar nodded. "Precisely. These systems create internal biological conflict that reduces overall efficiency." "Or," Elena said, manipulating the display to show temporal patterns, "these systems create multiple response options that allow humans to adapt to unpredictable circumstances. When one approach doesn't work, we automatically have others available." "Miss Vasquez, biological efficiency is well-established scientific principle." "Is it?" Elena interrupted, something she had never done before in this office. "Because the reports from Tau Ceti suggest that human inefficiency just held off a superior force for 6 days longer than Alliance projections indicated possible." Professor Zektar's skin patterns shifted to a color Elena didn't recognize. "Miss Vasquez, I should inform you that several faculty members have expressed concern about your recent behavior. You've become more confrontational in class discussions." "Have I?" Elena smiled, and realized it was the first genuine smile she had felt in weeks. "Or have I become more human?" She stood and gathered her equipment. "Professor, I appreciate all the years you've spent teaching me about the elegant efficiency of other species. but I think it's time for me to teach you something about the chaotic inefficiency of my own. Elena left the office and made her way to the station's communications center. It was time to start sharing her recordings beyond her personal logs. The communication center hummed with the activity of students from dozens of species maintaining contact with their home worlds. Elena had rarely used these facilities before. Her communications with Earth had always been routed through academic channels. But today, she was going to try something different. She uploaded her recordings to the Galactic Data Network using her student access codes, but instead of filing them in the academic archives, she tagged them with metadata that would make them accessible through entertainment and news feeds. Elena wasn't trying to publish scholarly articles, she was trying to tell a story. Within hours, she received her first response, a message from a human freighter captain named Rebecca Chen. Elena Vasquez, I don't know who you are, but your recordings just saved my crew. Captain Chen's face filled the screen, streaked with soot and exhaustion. We've been running supply lines to the border colonies, and your analysis of Alliance tactical patterns helped us avoid 3 ambush points. More importantly, your documentation of human adaptation strategies gave my people hope when we thought we were fighting an impossible war. Elena felt something shift in her chest. A warmth that had nothing to do with the station's environmental systems. More messages followed over the next several days. Colonial defenders who had used her tactical analyses to improve their defensive strategies. Refugee groups who had found comfort in her documentation of human resilience. Earth military units who had incorporated her observations about Alliance assumptions into their strategic planning. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. Alien students on other consortium stations. Miss Vasquez, the message began. My name is Veltar, and I'm a Lyrian studying comparative sociology at the Arcturus Academic Complex. Your recordings have been circulating through our student networks, and I wanted you to know that they're generating significant discussion among non-human students. Elena opened this message with particular interest. Your documentation of human responses to adversity has prompted many of us to reconsider our understanding of your species. We were taught that human emotional volatility represented psychological instability, but your recordings suggest that emotional complexity might actually enhance adaptability under stress. Elena paused the message and looked around the communication center. Several alien students were working at nearby terminals, but none of them seemed to be paying attention to her activities. She continued the message. I've shared your recordings with my professors, and they've begun incorporating your observations into their curriculum, not as examples of human inefficiency, but as case studies in alternative evolutionary strategies. Miss Vasquez, I believe your work is changing how the academic community views humanity. Elena realized she was holding her breath. She finished the message and immediately began composing a response, but before she could send it, her tablet chimed with an urgent communication from Earth. Her mother's face appeared on the screen, but Dr. Sarah Vasquez looked completely different from the worried woman who had sent the original warning 3 weeks ago. She looked proud. Elena, sweetheart, I don't know how you did it, but your recordings are being discussed in the highest levels of Earth government. The military command is using your tactical analyses. The diplomatic corps is referencing your cultural observations, and the intelligence services are using your documentation of Alliance assumptions to predict their strategic moves. Elena felt dizzy. More importantly, your recordings are spreading through civilian populations across human space. People are sharing them, adding their own observations, creating a collaborative record of how humanity responds to existential threats. Elena, you've created something that none of our formal intelligence networks could achieve, a real-time cultural documentation that's helping humans understand their own capabilities. Her mother paused, and Elena could see tears in her eyes. But that's not the most remarkable thing that's happening. Elena, Your recordings are spreading through alien networks, too. Species that declared war on humanity are watching human civilians analyze their own responses to adversity, and apparently, it's making them uncomfortable. Elena's heart began racing. The Alliance expected humanity to break down when faced with superior force. They planned their strategy around human psychological profiles that suggested we would choose survival over resistance when presented with overwhelming odds. But your recordings are showing the galaxy that humans don't just refuse to break. We get more creative as conditions get worse. Elena thought about the past 3 weeks of her own behavior. The quiet student who used to avoid confrontation had challenged professors, questioned assumptions, and begun actively documenting everything she observed. Her mother was right. Humans didn't break under pressure. They became more themselves. Elena, I need you to continue what you're doing, but I also need you to be careful. Your recordings are having an impact beyond anything we anticipated. The Alliance academic communities that pushed for this war are beginning to realize they may have fundamentally misunderstood their enemy. Elena smiled, thinking about Professor Zektar's discomfort during their recent conversation. Keep recording, sweetheart. The galaxy needs to see who we really are. The message ended, and Elena sat back in her chair, processing everything she had just learned. Her simple documentation project had somehow evolved into something much larger, a collaborative narrative that was helping humanity understand itself while simultaneously educating the galaxy about human capabilities. She activated her recording equipment and looked directly into the camera. Day 24 of the war. I've just learned that these recordings are being shared far beyond my original intent. What started as personal documentation has become part of a larger story about human adaptation and resilience. Elena paused, thinking about the Lyrian student's message, her mother's report, and the dozens of other responses she had received. I think I'm beginning to understand why the Alliance academic communities pushed for this war, and why they're now starting to question their decision. They studied humanity from a distance, treating us like specimens in a controlled experiment. They cataloged our inefficiencies, documented our irrationalities, and concluded that we were a threat to galactic stability. Elena looked around the communications center at her alien classmates, most of whom continued to ignore her presence. But there's a difference between studying humans and understanding humans, and apparently, the galaxy is starting to learn that difference. She ended the recording and began uploading the day's documentation to the network. Elena had no way of knowing that her recordings were already being viewed by millions of individuals across dozens of star systems, or that Alliance military commanders were beginning to request detailed psychological profiles of human unpredictability. All she knew was that the quiet student nobody noticed had found her voice, and the galaxy was listening. Elena discovered she had become famous by accident. She was in the station's library, researching comparative military psychology for her latest recording, when she noticed a group of Arthanian students clustered around a holographic display. Their mandibles were clicking in rapid patterns that Elena had learned indicated intense discussion. Curious, she moved closer and realized they were watching one of her recordings, specifically her analysis of human defensive strategies during the siege of New Canberra. But they weren't just watching, they were taking notes. The human tendency toward improvisation, one of the Arthanians was saying, her translator converting the complex clicking into standard galactic, appears to stem from neural architecture that maintains multiple solution pathways simultaneously. This explains their ability to adapt tactics in real time when primary strategies fail. Elena froze. These weren't casual viewers. These students were conducting serious academic analysis of her work. "Excuse me," Elena said, approaching the group. "I couldn't help but notice you're studying human tactical responses." The Arthanians turned toward her, their compound eyes registering her presence with what Elena had learned to recognize as startled attention. One of them, a student Elena vaguely remembered from an astrobiology seminar, stepped forward. "You're Elena Vasquez," she said, her mandibles clicking with what sounded like excitement. "Your documentation of human war responses has become required viewing in our military sociology courses. Professor Hectara says your work represents the most comprehensive real-time analysis of human psychological adaptation ever recorded." Elena blinked. "Required viewing?" "Across 17 different academic institutions in 4-star systems," another Arthanian confirmed. "Your recordings are being used to completely revise Alliance understanding of human capabilities. Some military strategists are calling for immediate ceasefire negotiations based on your analysis." Elena felt the familiar sensation of her world shifting beneath her feet. Over the past 6 weeks, she had been so focused on documenting events as they unfolded that she hadn't fully grasped the scope of her recording's impact. She excused herself from the group and made her way to her dormitory room, her mind racing. Once there, she activated her communication terminal and accessed the Galactic Data Network to search for references to her work. What she found took her breath away. Her recordings had been viewed over 40 million times across hundreds of worlds. They had been translated into 63 different languages, spawned thousands of academic discussions, and generated response videos from military analysts, cultural anthropologists, and political commentators throughout known space. More importantly, they had been viewed by Alliance leadership. Elena opened a file that made her hands tremble. A formal communication from the Tri-Species Alliance High Command, addressed directly to her. "Miss Vasquez," the message began, "your documentation of human responses to adversity has been brought to our attention. We request a formal meeting to discuss your observations and their implications for current military operations." Elena read the message 3 times before the full meaning sank in. The Alliance wanted to negotiate with her. A 22-year-old xenobiology student had somehow become significant enough to warrant direct contact from the military leadership of 3 star-spanning civilizations. She was still processing this information when her door chimed. Elena opened it to find Professor Zektar standing in the corridor, but he looked different from their last meeting. His crystalline skin showed patterns Elena had never seen before, complex spirals of silver and gold that seemed to indicate something beyond the simple emotional states she was familiar with. "Miss Vasquez, may I come in?" Elena nodded, stepping aside to allow the towering Kethani into her small dormitory room. Professor Zektar moved carefully in the limited space, his 4 arms folded in what Elena recognized as a gesture of formal respect. "Miss Vasquez, I owe you an apology." Elena blinked in surprise. "Professor, for 3 years I taught you about the inefficiencies of human biology and psychology. I presented these characteristics as evolutionary failures, evidence that humanity represented a less developed form of intelligence." Professor Zektar's skin patterns shifted to deeper gold. "I was wrong." Elena gestured for him to sit in her desk chair while she perched on the edge of her bed. "Professor, you were teaching established scientific consensus." "No," Professor Zektar interrupted. "I was teaching cultural bias disguised as scientific analysis." "Miss Vasquez, your recordings have done more than document human responses to war. They've revealed fundamental flaws in how the galactic academic community studies intelligence and adaptation." Elena waited for him to continue. "Your work has shown that what we interpreted as chaotic inefficiency is actually adaptive flexibility. What we saw as emotional instability is actually emotional range that allows for creative problem-solving under stress. What we dismissed as biological redundancy is actually multiple backup systems that activate when primary approaches fail." Professor Zektar paused, his skin shifting to patterns Elena was beginning to recognize as intellectual excitement. "Miss Vasquez, your species has been fighting this war for 6 weeks against overwhelming odds, and instead of breaking down as our models predicted, humans have become more innovative with each defeat. Your people have turned agricultural tools into weapons, converted civilian infrastructure into defensive systems, and used cultural practices as tactical advantages. It's unprecedented." Elena thought about the reports that had been flowing through her communication channels over the past weeks. Human colonies that had held out longer than should have been possible. Refugee groups that had evaded capture by using survival techniques no military manual had ever documented. Civilian populations that had somehow maintained morale and coordination despite losing everything. "Professor, what you're describing sounds like stubborn desperation, not adaptive intelligence." "Does it?" Professor Zektar's skin patterns brightened. "Miss Vasquez, my species achieved spaceflight because we developed perfect crystalline matrices that allowed us to build efficient, durable technology. The Lyrians reached the stars through mathematical precision that eliminated waste and error from their development processes. The Arthanians succeeded through collective intelligence that made individual limitations irrelevant." Elena nodded. "Elegant solutions. Efficient approaches." "Exactly. And because our paths to success were elegant and efficient, we assumed that intelligence itself required elegance and efficiency. We looked at human development and saw chaos because we didn't understand that there might be other paths to success." Professor Zektar gestured toward Elena's tablet, where her latest recordings were stored. "Your documentation has shown us that humans didn't achieve spaceflight despite your chaos. You achieved it because of your chaos. Your species' tendency toward seemingly irrational responses, emotional complexity, and biological redundancy isn't evidence of evolutionary failure. It's evidence of evolutionary success through adaptation to unpredictability." Elena felt something clicking into place in her mind. "You're saying that human inefficiency is actually a feature, not a bug." "I'm saying that your species evolved to survive uncertainty, and we've just created the most uncertain situation imaginable by declaring war on you." Professor Zektar's skin patterns shifted to what Elena had learned indicated deep concern. "Miss Vasquez, the Alliance leadership is beginning to realize that they may have awakened something they don't know how to handle." Elena activated her recording equipment. This conversation was too important not to document. "Professor, what exactly are they afraid of?" "They're afraid of what your recordings are teaching the galaxy about the nature of intelligence itself." Professor Zektar looked directly at the camera. "Miss Vasquez, your work isn't just changing how we view humanity, it's changing how we view ourselves." Elena waited for him to elaborate. "Every species in the Alliance achieved success through specialization. We became very good at specific types of problem solving, and we built our civilizations around those strengths. But specialization creates brittleness. When we encounter problems that don't match our specialized solutions, we struggle to adapt." Elena thought about her own experience over the past 6 weeks. The quiet student who had spent years passively absorbing information had transformed into someone who actively challenged assumptions and documented uncomfortable truths. Humans, by contrast, seem to maintain multiple approaches to every problem simultaneously. When one method fails, you don't break down, you switch to a different method. When that fails, you invent new methods. It's not efficient, but it's incredibly robust. Professor Zektar paused, his skin patterns shifting to colors Elena couldn't interpret. "Miss Vasquez, your recordings are teaching the galaxy that there might be advantages to inefficiency, benefits to chaos, and strength in what we previously considered weakness. That's a dangerous lesson for species that have built their entire identities around being more efficient than everyone else." Elena realized she was beginning to understand the scope of what her documentation project had become. The Alliance declared war to contain human influence, but my recordings are spreading human perspectives throughout their own populations. Precisely. Young beings throughout Alliance space are watching your work and asking uncomfortable questions about their own society's limitations. They're wondering if efficiency might actually be a weakness when circumstances become unpredictable. Professor Zektar stood to leave, but paused at the door. Miss Vasquez, I came here to apologize, but I also came to warn you. The Alliance High Command's request for a meeting isn't just diplomatic curiosity. They're trying to determine whether the war they started can still be won, or whether they've accidentally triggered something that will fundamentally change galactic civilization. After he left, Elena sat in her small room, surrounded by 6 weeks of recordings that had somehow evolved from personal documentation into galactic transformation. She looked at the camera and began what would become her most important recording. Day 43 of the war. I've just learned that these recordings have become something I never intended them to be. What started as one student's documentation of events has apparently become a catalyst for questioning fundamental assumptions about intelligence, adaptation, and strength. Elena paused, thinking about her conversation with Professor Zektar, the messages from viewers throughout the galaxy, and the formal communication from Alliance leadership. I think I'm beginning to understand what's really happening here. The Alliance didn't just declare war on human space, they declared war on human ways of thinking. They wanted to prove that their approaches to problem-solving were superior to ours, that their efficiency made them stronger than our chaos. Elena smiled, remembering her mother's words from 6 weeks ago about humans being built for survival rather than efficiency. But by documenting how humans actually respond to existential threats, these recordings have shown the galaxy something the Alliance never anticipated, that efficiency might not be the only measure of intelligence, and that what looks like weakness might actually be strength in disguise. Elena looked around her dormitory room, thinking about how much had changed since she received her mother's first message. The quiet student nobody noticed had become the voice of human resilience, and her simple documentation project had become a weapon that might end the war more effectively than any military strategy. Tomorrow, I'm going to respond to the Alliance request for a meeting, not as a negotiator or diplomat, but as a teacher. If the galaxy wants to understand humanity, I'm going to show them everything we're capable of. Elena ended the recording and began preparing her response to the Alliance High Command. The war had begun with academic theories about human limitations, but it was going to end with a very different kind of education. The quiet student nobody noticed was about to give the galaxy its most important lesson about the nature of human strength, and she had a feeling they were going to be studying her recordings for generations to come.